Welcome back to the Sci-Fireplace. This is 5 books that I've read since the last 5 books I read video. First one is Eon by Greg Bear. This is the omnibus of Eon and its sequel, Eternity. I just read Eon, which was enough book for one pick for sure. Eon is, let me see here, 408 pages long. It's a long book, long, big, dumb object book, big dumb object story. I have not read Rendezvous with Rama. That's one of the classics that's missing from my brain. This, to my understanding, is a similar story. It's about a big, dumb asteroid that shows up in Earth's orbit, and a team of international scientists goes out to investigate it and eventually winds up living inside of its enormous interior, composed of multiple chambers that are each huge, big enough to contain whole cities. And strange things happen. It's the second Greg Bear book that I've read after Blood Music. Blood Music was on the top 15 video. I adore Blood Music. I thought Eon was going to be standing toe-to-toe with Blood Music in my estimation, because for the first half, maybe 2/3 of it, it's masterfully done. The stakes of the story feel truly apocalyptic, just huge stakes. Builds all this tension. The characters are really compelling. Tons of moving parts, really complicated story. When I was reading it, I kept thinking about it like it was a James Cameron movie, like it was this giant budget James Cameron movie. It builds itself up to the point where the kettle is about to boil over, and it seems like there's no real foreseeable way that things could be resolved satisfactorily without everybody suffering enormous consequences. And all of that tension is dissipated at around the 2/3 mark. And then after that, the action shifts over to different stakes with a different plot that I didn't find as interesting and was a little bit of a letdown. And also by that point, I was losing bandwidth in terms of my focus on the book because it's such a detailed story with so many moving parts that it is tough to keep track of. In fact, a lot of the like the warm-up period reading the book, or the orientation period, where you're kind of scrambling around trying to get your bearings for the first part of the story, which happens a lot with science fiction books. In here, it lasted at least 100 pages. It took a very, very long time, and it was great reading. But it's full of these small details where if you miss the detail or if you don't envision it properly, it has to do with like specific physical layouts of rooms and objects and how tech works. If you don't get it, it kind of muddles the rest of the narrative. It makes it much harder to follow. And I found myself frequently having to flip back to kind of work up a schematic in my head for these things that Bear was describing, which is actually one of the things about science fiction that I dislike. I don't like fiction like that. This book was so good that I was not bothered by it. But I would count that as a negative. And also, I developed a kind of fatigue. So I got, to be frank, slightly checked out for the last third of the book, which maybe shouldn't count as a criticism against it because I was not paying full attention to it. I kind of was wanting to get on to the next book. So I don't know how confident I am in commentating on the ending of the book. I still thought it was great. I still think that it's definitely worth reading. I was not left dying to read Eternity. There are 2 more books in addition to these 2 in the series. The Way by Greg Bear. That's the name of the series. I will eventually read Eternity, I think. I gave this one a 7 out of 10. That was picked by the random name picker app out of my whole collection of science fiction books, and so was this one. So in fact were all the rest on the list. The Palace of Eternity by Bob Shaw. I got this in a big thrift store haul, got a bunch of Bob Shaw titles, and there was something about them that just recommended themselves to me. I just had a feeling, a hunch about Bob Shaw because all the books had interesting titles, interesting covers, and there's just that X factor about the books. This actually was the one that I wanted to read the most, and it called to me the most. I know Orbitsville is his most well-known book. I don't have that one. People recommend a lot of Bob Shaw books to me. Ragged Astronauts, I have that one. It's up on the Sci-Fireplace. This is the first one that I've read. I thought it was astonishing. I thought it was like one of the better books that I have read. In fact, it was so good that it almost wound up on that top 15 video that I just put out, and I had just finished it. It stood a chance of being in that video. Ultimately, obviously, it wasn't, but it was that good. It starts as a fairly prosaic book. I thought it was going to be kind of formulaic, and was totally surprised. There was a sequence of big surprises in the book. It's about this retired military guy who lives on a fairly remote planet that's populated with artists and is working as a mechanic and has a love affair with the daughter of an official in the city where he lives. And the backdrop is this war with an alien species that looks like melting people. And I don't want to say much else for fear of spoiling even a little bit of the book. When I do this random name pick, when I just pick up these vintage paperbacks and I throw them in the hopper, this is really the kind of book that I want to land on. Something that I've never heard anybody talk about, although I have heard Bob Shaw brought up. Something about that long, and something that packs a giant punch disproportionate to its length and its level of notoriety. And that is this book. The characters are great. The world building is masterful. For as short as the book is, it's as big a feeling a space opera as a lot of those longer books that I've read, the big fat space operas. There are so many twists and turns that I was genuinely shocked in a number of places. I actually laughed out loud when I was reading the book because he pulls so many rabbits out of his hat when writing it. I just had no idea what was about to happen next. I gave it a 9 out of 10. It didn't have quite that X factor of being able to point to it as this is a seminal work or this is a real masterpiece with a capital M. But in terms of just a great piece of science fiction workmanship in which every element works properly, this is exemplary. This is one of the better books that I've read in the genre. And then I read Isle of the Dead by Zelazny, which I had high hopes for. The only other Zelazny that I've read is The Dream Master. No, I have not read Lord of Light. I know everybody's going to comment asking if I've read Lord of Light. I have not read it. This, to my understanding, is pretty similar, pretty close thematically to Lord of Light. And I guess to a lot of his books, he has a reputation of writing a bunch of science fiction that intermixes mythology and gods walking among men and meddling in their affairs. And that's kind of, a good nutshell of this. It's about a very wealthy guy who was trained in a kind of terraforming art where he uses some kind of only half-explained psychic influence or technological process to create entire worlds by his own creative vision. And he is beset by an unseen enemy who is summoning him to a world of his past creation for potential mischief. I didn't really like it all that much, I have to say. It was written in 1969. It reminded me actually of The Cat Who Walks Through Walls, a book that I DNF'd pretty hard by Heinlein. And I DNF'd it because it was the same kind of smug, boozy, swashbuckling protagonist character and that kind of humor of just neither interesting nor funny, really. And the book seemed to be preoccupied with the task of being smarmy and clever and quippy, as opposed to rich or readable or actually funny. And I hate that, not just in books, in pretty much everything. I can't watch most comedy for that same reason of the quippiness, the cleverness. I think it's bullshit. I hate it. And there was a lot of that in this. The humor just did not age very well. And it's just a little bit too stonered out. There were a lot of conflicting, overlapping, I guess, magic systems that didn't mesh all that well. It was a little confusing. The action wasn't all that exciting, and it failed to build up a sense of urgency or stakes. It was okay. Zelazny's prose is interesting. There are passages that felt a little bit like the prose from Dream Master, which I thought was superb. I've talked a lot about how beautiful I think the prose in that book is. It never hit that level of perfection, but it is mechanically interesting. Ultimately, I was kind of just bored reading this book and ready for it to be over with. I think this is an also ran with Zelazny. I don't hear this talked about all that much, and he was prolific, so nothing against Zelazny, you know. You can't write however many books he did without writing a couple duds. I gave this a 6 out of 10. Next was Ancient My Enemy by Gordon R. Dickson. This is the second book I've read from Dickson. The other one was Masters of Everon. This is a short story anthology. I thought it was overall good. Some of the stories were very good. A lot of them were a little boilerplate, not that great. Two in particular stood out to me. The first one, the title story, Ancient My Enemy, and the last one, The Bleak and Barren Land, which was thematically very closely related. In fact, I think Ancient My Enemy drew from the same well in large part, and maybe was kind of a different coat of paint that he put on that story after the fact. And Ancient My Enemy was the most recent one, which was published in 1969 again. Bleak and Barren Land was 1952, which is pretty amazing. Those stories are really, I would say, sophisticated, subtle, meaningful. They have to do with human settlers on desert planets interacting with the alien life in a not necessarily friendly way. The first one is the best. Ancient My Enemy is the best story in the anthology by a pretty big margin. It's about prospectors on this planet where the daytime temperatures get so boiling hot that you can't survive, so you have to burrow or find a cave and live in this sleeping bag that insulates you against the heat. And the prospectors have been at war with the native aliens for the whole time that they've been on the planet. And one of the prospectors develops an interesting relationship with an individual from the other side, from an alien. So it feels a little bit like Enemy Mine. It feels a little bit like Dune. And it's short, it's punchy, and it has an ending that's a little haunting and resonant. I thought it was really good. Bleak and Barren Land, I think pretty much everything that I said about Ancient My Enemy goes for that one too. There's one other story that I thought was interesting called Our First Death. That's about a colony, a far-flung space colony on a distant planet peopled by kind of mediocre middle managers and tradesmen, unremarkable people, and there's a death in the colony, and it's them meditating on what the cause of death was. I thought it was really uncharacteristic of Dickson. It was really heavy, dark, and bleak, which is not typically what I've read from Dickson. The rest of the stories weren't anything all that special to me. There was a pretty heavy flavor of the pulp daring do-ery that I don't really care for so much. Hard stripe of bootstrappy conservatism, which is another flavor that I don't particularly care for. There were some clever twists and turns, which is typical of stories from that period. So they're well-crafted stories, just not all that interesting to me. I think I gave this one 6 out of 10. Then I randomly picked The Wall Around Eden by, let's try to pronounce her name, Joan Slonczewski. I basically picked this up because I thought the cover was neat. I DNF'd it after 2 chapters. It just was not for me. It's about aliens who visit Earth and precipitate a nuclear war between America and the USSR, and then trap cities of people under domes, which is kind of a familiar trope. There's just something about it that I found really bland. It just didn't catch me at all. And then finally, random picked this one, Highway of Eternity by Clifford Simak. And you may look at that cover and say, wow, that looks very gray and dull. And you would be correct. It's another dull book that I randomly picked. The other Simak that I finished was City, which was in the top 15 video. It's one of my favorite science fiction books. I think it's great. This felt very much superficially like City, painted with like the same palette of colors: robots, dogs, narrative taking place at various stages through a long span of time. Forests, the forests of Michigan. It felt like city or looked like city. I'll say that it looked like city, didn't feel like city. It just didn't have the same heart, and the characters were not nearly as interesting. Nothing about the book was all that interesting, and it felt like a grab bag of a bunch of different ideas that Simak had sitting around and didn't really know what to do with it, so he smashed them all into one book and kind of tried to make it work, but it never got over the hump of actually working or being interesting or having any kind of tension or drama that would sustain me through the reading experience. At no point did I have like a burning need to answer the questions that are posed in the premise, which is a problem. The premise is there's a contingent of people in the future who battle against an alien race who come to Earth and persuade the majority of the human population to undergo a physical transformation to be non-corporeal beings. And these exiles are hunted by the aliens through time because they have these time machines that they take backwards and forwards in time, fleeing hunter-killer robots, kind of like the Terminator. Or I guess not hunter-killer, hunter-trapper robots, trying to capture them and bring them back to be assimilated, I guess. They encounter people, a couple characters from the 21st century, a detective and like a reporter, I think. And one of them has the ability to phase in and out of an alternate dimension. And it just was dull and gray, and everything held together a little too loosely. It was like a kaleidoscope of kind of just uninteresting baubles dangling around. Did I say kaleidoscope? A mobile. It was like a mobile. Anyway, I messed that metaphor up. I did finish it. I thought it was pretty close to a perfect 5, which is actually gratifying when you find one. I think I've talked about this a couple times. I love the perfect 5 game. You have to come up with the title of like a book or a movie or whatever that is a perfect 5 out of 10. It can't be good enough to be a 6 or bad enough to be a 4. It has to be perfectly mediocre. And this, I think, is the rare perfect 5. So I am taking a break from the random pick because that's a terrible feeling to have all of these big famous canonical masterpieces on hand that I want to read and get under my belt, and can't quite reach them with the random picker. I've tried to winnow down my collection so it's just stuff that I really want to read, but the random picker keeps finding the fissures and the ones that aren't really worth the time. So for a while, I'm just going to pick the ones that I want and read those. I'm reading Roadside Picnic right now. I just started it last night. It's great. I'm just going to go on a run and just pick titles I want to read and not screw around with the random picker for a while, although it is fun to do. So thanks for watching. I am doing 100 books. This is number 5 to 10. See you on the next one.